There's a moment most people can't quite explain. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not a dramatic betrayal you can clearly point to. It's quieter than that. It's the slow realization that something about the connection never fully adds up. You feel close, but not secure, chosen, but not prioritized, important, but somehow still optional. And the more you try to understand it, the more confusing it becomes. Because on the surface, everything seems real. The conversations feel deep. The chemistry feels undeniable. The moments you share feel meaningful. But underneath all of that, there's an inconsistency that never fully goes away. A subtle instability that keeps you slightly off balance, like you're always trying to catch up to something that keeps shifting just out of reach. And what you may not realize is that this feeling isn't accidental. It's not just bad timing, it's not just miscommunication. For some people, this dynamic is built into the way they connect, not because they're intentionally trying to hurt you in some obvious, calculated way, but because they are operating from a place where emotional closeness feels both desired and threatening at the same time. And instead of choosing one person and fully stepping into that vulnerability, they create something else entirely, a system where multiple connections exist at once, where no single person holds all of their attention, where emotional investment is spread out just enough to prevent anyone from getting too close, including you. And this is where things start to become clearer, because what feels like confusion on your end is often structure on theirs. What feels unpredictable to you is actually a pattern they repeat, a pattern that allows them to stay connected without ever fully committing. And once you begin to see this pattern, a lot of things that didn't make sense before start to click into place in a way that's hard to ignore. It usually doesn't start in an obvious way. There's no moment where they sit you down and explain that they're keeping multiple options open. There's no clear signal that says you're not the only one they're emotionally engaging with. Instead, it begins quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. In the early stages, everything can feel surprisingly intense. The attention is there, the interest feels genuine, the way they show up makes it seem like something real is building between you. And because of that, you naturally begin to invest, you open up, you start to trust the connection, you allow yourself to believe that this could become something meaningful. But while you're leaning deeper into that connection, something else is happening in the background. Their attention isn't fully centered in one place. It's distributed, not necessarily in a chaotic or reckless way, but in a controlled, intentional way that allows them to maintain multiple emotional outlets at the same time. And because they're skilled at keeping each connection separate, you don't immediately see it. Each interaction you have with them feels personal, focused, real. And that's what makes it so difficult to detect, because nothing feels fake in the moment. It just feels incomplete over time. You start noticing gaps, delays, inconsistencies that don't quite align with the level of connection you thought you were building. And at first, you try to explain it in ways that make sense to you. Maybe they're busy, maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they just need space. But what you're actually experiencing is something deeper than that. You're experiencing the effects of being one part of a larger emotional structure that you were never made fully aware of. A structure designed to keep things open, flexible, and non-binding. And the more you stay in it, the more you begin to feel that quiet tension between what you're giving and what you're receiving. For someone operating this way, one person is rarely enough. Not because the people they connect with lack value, but because relying on one person creates a level of emotional exposure they're not comfortable with. When everything is invested in a single connection, there's risk, real risk. The risk of needing someone too much, the risk of being seen too deeply, the risk of losing control if that connection changes or ends. And for someone who associates closeness with vulnerability in a way that feels unsafe, that risk becomes something to avoid rather than embrace. So instead of placing all of their emotional investment in one place, they spread it out. They create multiple points of connection so that no single relationship carries too much weight. If one connection becomes overwhelming, they shift their focus to another. If one person starts asking for more depth or clarity, they pull back and lean into a different dynamic where the expectations are lighter. And this isn't always done with conscious intent to deceive. In many cases, it feels like a form of self-protection to them, a way to stay connected without feeling trapped, a way to experience closeness without fully surrendering to it. But for the person on the other side, for you, the impact is very different, because while they're managing multiple emotional streams, You're experiencing one connection that feels inconsistent, unpredictable, and at times deeply confusing. You're trying to build something stable with someone who has structured their emotional world in a way that resists stability. And that mismatch creates a kind of tension that slowly wears you down over time, even if you can't immediately explain why. And if you look back, there's a good chance you felt that inconsistency early on, maybe not in a way that felt clear or obvious, but in small moments that didn't quite align. The way they could be fully present one day and distant the next, the way conversations could feel deep and engaging, and then suddenly become surface level or delayed. The way their energy seemed to shift without a clear reason. These moments often get overlooked at first because they're easy to rationalize. You tell yourself it's normal. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You focus on the good moments because they feel so real, so convincing, so worth holding on to. But those inconsistencies are not random. They're reflections of divided attention, of emotional energy being allocated in more than one direction. And the reason it feels so confusing is because when they are present with you, they can be very present, engaged, attentive, even emotionally open in a way that makes you feel seen. But that presence doesn't remain consistent because it's not exclusive. It's part of a rotation, a shifting of focus that moves between different connections depending on what feels manageable for them in that moment. And so you find yourself trying to make sense of something that doesn't follow a stable pattern. You try to adjust your expectations, you try to be patient, you try to not ask for too much, but the underlying feeling doesn't go away. That sense that something isn't fully grounded, that something is always slightly out of reach no matter how much you invest. And over time, that feeling begins to affect how you show up. You become more cautious, more aware, more unsure of where you actually stand, and that uncertainty becomes part of the experience itself. What makes it even more complex is the illusion of exclusivity that can exist within this dynamic, because even while they are maintaining multiple connections, the way they interact with you can still feel deeply personal. They may say things that make you feel unique. They may share moments that seem intimate, meaningful, even rare, and in those moments, it feels like what you have with them stands apart from anything else, like there's something special being built that exists only between the two of you. And that feeling is powerful. It creates attachment. It deepens your investment. It makes you more willing to overlook the inconsistencies because the connection, when it's present, feels so significant. But what you don't see is that similar dynamics can be happening in parallel, not identical in every detail, but similar in structure. The same level of measured openness, the same balance between closeness and distance, the same ability to make each person feel individually valued without fully committing to any one connection. And this is where the emotional confusion intensifies, because your experience feels real and it is real. The emotions you feel are genuine. The connection you perceive has elements of truth in it, but it's not the full picture. It's one part of a broader pattern that is designed to maintain flexibility rather than commitment. And as long as that pattern continues, the clarity you're hoping for remains just out of reach. Not because you're missing something, but because the structure itself is built in a way that prevents that clarity from ever fully forming. And that lack of clarity doesn't just stay on the surface of the connection, it begins to shape how deeply you allow yourself to feel within it, because at some point, whether you consciously recognize it or not, you start adjusting. You start holding parts of yourself back. You start measuring what you say, how much you express, how much you reveal, not because you've stopped caring, but because something inside you senses that giving too much might not be safe here. And what's happening on their side mirrors this in a very specific way. The emotional depth they offer is not random. It's carefully measured, not necessarily in a cold or calculated way, but in a controlled way that keeps everything within a certain range. They may open up just enough to create a sense of closeness, just enough to make you feel like you're getting somewhere real, but rarely enough to fully anchor the connection into something stable and defined. And this balance they maintain serves a purpose, because the moment emotional depth crosses a certain threshold, it creates expectations, it creates attachment, it creates the possibility of being needed in a way that feels overwhelming to them. So instead of allowing things to reach that level, they keep it just below it, a space where the connection feels meaningful, but not binding, where emotions are present, but not fully exposed. And for you, this creates a constant sense of almost understood, almost chosen, almost secure, but never fully there. And that almost becomes one of the most emotionally draining places to exist because it keeps you invested without ever giving you the stability you're naturally searching for. And one of the ways this is maintained is through the avoidance of clear labels. Because labels define things, they create boundaries, they establish roles and expectations that make it harder to move freely between different connections. And for someone who is juggling multiple emotional dynamics, that kind of definition feels limiting. It closes doors that they want to keep open. So instead, things are kept ambiguous. Conversations about what this is are delayed, redirected, or softened into something less concrete. You might hear phrases that sound reassuring, but don't actually clarify anything. Words that feel comforting in the moment, but leave space for interpretation later, and this ambiguity serves as a protective layer. It allows them to engage deeply when it feels comfortable and pull back when it doesn't, without technically violating any defined agreement. But for you, this lack of definition creates a different kind of pressure, because without clarity, you're left to interpret the connection based on behavior rather than mutual understanding. You're left to fill in the gaps with hope, with assumptions, with the belief that things will eventually become clearer if you just stay patient long enough. But the truth is, the ambiguity is not a phase they're moving through. It's a structure they're maintaining, because as long as things remain undefined, they retain the flexibility to move between different connections without fully confronting the impact of that movement on any one person. And that includes you. This is where the idea of the backup plan starts to take a more concrete shape, not in a way that feels openly acknowledged, but in the way the connection functions over time. Because when someone is emotionally invested in multiple directions, they begin to position people in ways that serve different roles. Some connections may feel lighter, more surface level, easier to engage with when they want distraction or escape. Others may carry more emotional depth, more familiarity, more history. And you might find yourself in a position where you are not fully let go, but never fully chosen either. You are kept close enough to maintain the connection, but not prioritized in a way that reflects true commitment. And this position can feel incredibly confusing because it doesn't look like rejection on the surface. They still reach out, they still engage, they still create moments that feel meaningful, but those moments are not consistent. They are spaced out, conditional, often appearing when other connections fade, become complicated, or no longer meet their immediate emotional needs. And in those moments, it can feel like you're being pulled back into something real. Like maybe this time it's different, maybe this time they're choosing you. But what's actually happening is a shift in their attention, not a shift in their intention. And unless the underlying pattern changes, that shift is temporary. Because as soon as another connection becomes available or more appealing, the cycle repeats, and you're left once again trying to understand why something that felt so real can disappear just as quickly as it appeared. And this movement between connections is not chaotic in the way it might seem from the outside. It's often structured around emotional thresholds. When one connection begins to feel too intense, too demanding, or too emotionally exposing, they instinctively pull away from it. Not necessarily because they no longer care, but because the level of closeness has crossed into territory that feels uncomfortable for them. And instead of working through that discomfort within the same connection, they shift their focus to another one where the intensity is lower, where the expectations are lighter, where they can regain a sense of control. And this rotation allows them to regulate their emotional experience without having to fully confront the deeper fears that come with sustained intimacy. But for the people on the other side of this rotation, the experience is very different. Because when they pull away from you, it doesn't feel like emotional regulation. It feels like loss. It feels like confusion. It feels like something meaningful being withdrawn without explanation. And when they return, it doesn't feel like a natural continuation. It feels like a sudden re-entry that disrupts whatever sense of closure you were trying to build in their absence. And this back and forth creates a kind of emotional instability that is incredibly difficult to ground yourself in because the connection never follows a consistent path. It moves in cycles that are driven by their internal thresholds, not by a shared understanding of what the relationship is supposed to be. At the core of all all of this, there is a fear that often goes unspoken but deeply felt. A fear of dependency, a fear of vulnerability, a fear of losing control in a space where emotions are no longer contained or predictable. Because real closeness requires something that feels risky to them. It requires presence, consistency, a willingness to be seen fully and to see someone else in return without constantly managing the distance between you. And for someone who has learned to associate that level of closeness with discomfort or even emotional threat, maintaining multiple connections becomes a way to avoid fully stepping into that space. It allows them to experience connection in controlled doses, to engage when it feels safe and disengage when it doesn't, without ever having to fully surrender to the depth that a single, committed connection would require. But understanding this fear doesn't erase the impact it has on you, because while they are protecting themselves from something that feels overwhelming, you are experiencing the consequences of that protection in a very real and personal way. You are navigating a connection that never fully stabilizes. You are investing in something that never fully settles into clarity, and over time, that experience can begin to affect how you see yourself within the connection. You start to question your value, your worth, your place in their life, not because those things are actually diminished, but because the way the connection is structured makes it feel like they are. And that is where the emotional weight of this dynamic becomes the hardest to carry. And when you stay in that space long enough, something begins to shift inside you in a way that's difficult to notice at first. It doesn't feel like a sudden change. It feels gradual, almost invisible, but over time you start to feel replaceable. Not because anyone directly told you that you are, but because the way the connection moves begins to mirror that feeling back to you. The inconsistency, the emotional distance, the way they can disappear and reappear without fully acknowledging the impact, it all starts to create a quiet narrative in your mind, a narrative that says maybe you're not as important as you thought. Maybe what you felt wasn't as significant as it seemed. And this is one of the most painful parts of this dynamic, because it slowly disconnects you from your own sense of certainty. You begin to measure your worth through their attention, through their presence, through how much or how little they choose to engage with you. And when that attention is inconsistent, your sense of value starts to feel inconsistent too. But the truth underneath all of this is something very different. It's not that you are replaceable, it's that in their system, everyone is. Not because people lack depth or meaning, but because treating connections as interchangeable is what allows them to avoid fully depending on any one person. It keeps them emotionally protected. It prevents any single loss from feeling too overwhelming. But for you, being part of that system doesn't feel like protection. It feels like being kept at a distance in a way that slowly erodes your sense of being chosen. And what makes this even more complex is that the mixed signals you receive along the way don't feel accidental. They feel confusing, but also intentional in their effect. Not necessarily because they are consciously trying to manipulate you at every step, but because the way they engage creates a push and pull dynamic that naturally keeps you emotionally invested. One moment, they are present in a way that feels genuine and connected. They say the right things. They show a level of care that feels real. And just as you begin to settle into that feeling, it shifts. They become distant, less responsive, less available. And that sudden contrast pulls you back into uncertainty. It makes you question what changed. It makes you look for answers. It keeps your attention locked onto the connection, trying to understand it, trying to stabilize it, trying to get back to the version of them that felt so real just moments before. And this cycle repeats itself in a way that creates a kind of emotional loop, a loop where you're constantly trying to regain something that was never consistently maintained in the first place. And because those moments of closeness feel so authentic, so emotionally charged, they become the reference point you keep returning to, the proof you use to convince yourself that what you're experiencing is real, even when the overall pattern continues to create instability. A big part of why this pattern continues is rooted in emotional unavailability. Not in the sense that they feel nothing, but in the sense that they cannot consistently sustain emotional presence at the level required for a stable, committed connection. There is always a certain distance they maintain, a boundary that isn't clearly spoken, but consistently enforced through behavior. They allow connection, but only to a point, point, they allow closeness, but only within limits that feel manageable to them. And whenever those limits are approached or crossed, the distance returns. And this creates a very specific kind of experience for you because you're not dealing with someone who is completely absent. If they were, it would be easier to recognize and walk away. Instead, you're dealing with someone who is partially available, someone who shows up just enough to keep the connection alive, but not enough to fully support it. And that partial availability is what makes it so difficult to detach from, because it gives you something to hold on to, something to believe in, even when the overall experience continues to feel unsteady. And over time, you may find yourself adjusting to this level of availability in ways that slowly move you away from your own needs. You begin to accept less than what you would normally require to feel secure. You begin to normalize inconsistency. You begin to make space for behavior that, in a different context, you would immediately recognize as misaligned with what you truly want. And then there are the moments when they come back after pulling away, moments that can feel incredibly powerful because they seem to confirm that the connection still matters to them. After a period of distance, silence, or emotional withdrawal, they reappear with a level of attention that feels almost relieving, like something you were missing has suddenly returned. And in those moments, it's easy to believe that the absence meant something, that maybe they needed time, maybe they were processing something, maybe now they're ready to show up differently. But what often goes unnoticed is the timing of these returns. They don't always come from a place of clarity or commitment. They often come from a shift in their emotional environment, a moment where another connection has faded, become complicated, or no longer fulfills the role it once did. And in that space, they return to what feels familiar, what feels safe, what feels available. And that's where you are, still connected, still open, still willing to engage. And so the cycle continues. They step back in, the connection reignites, and for a moment, it feels like something is finally aligning. But unless something deeper has changed within them, that alignment is temporary because the underlying pattern hasn't been addressed. And eventually, the same distance that appeared before begins to show up again, repeating the cycle in a way that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. And this is where the emotional experience starts to form a very specific pattern of its own, a cycle of hope and disappointment that becomes deeply ingrained over time. You begin to anticipate their return even when they're gone. You begin to hold on to the possibility of what the connection could be, even when the reality continues to fall short of that vision. And each time they re-engage, the hope resurfaces. The belief that maybe this time will be different, that maybe the inconsistency was just a phase, that maybe now something will finally stabilize. But when the pattern repeats, the disappointment feels heavier each time because it's not just about the moment anymore. It's about the accumulation of moments. The repeated experience of investing, hoping, and then feeling that sense of instability return. And over time, the cycle can begin to drain you in ways that go beyond the connection itself. It affects your emotional energy, your sense of clarity, your ability to trust your own perception of what's happening, because you've been in a dynamic where reality feels fluid, where consistency is temporary, where clarity is always just slightly out of reach. And that kind of experience doesn't just stay contained within the relationship, it starts to influence how you see connection as a whole. And that is where the weight of this dynamic becomes something you can no longer ignore, even if part of you still wants to hold on. And after everything you've felt, everything you've tried to understand, everything you've held on to, even when it didn't fully make sense, there comes a point where something inside you begins to shift, not loudly, not all at once, but quietly in a way that feels different from anything before. Because instead of trying to figure them out, you start to notice yourself. You start to notice how much you've been adjusting, how much you've been accommodating a pattern that never truly meets you where you are. And this is where one of the most important realizations begins to take shape. Because up until now, so much of your focus has been on understanding their behavior, why they pull away, why they come back, why things never fully stabilize. But as that awareness deepens, your attention starts to move in a different direction, toward what you've been accepting, toward what you've been tolerating, toward the gap between what you feel and what you've actually been receiving. And this is where the pattern begins to lose its hold. Not because they've changed, but because you're starting to see it clearly enough that you can no longer participate in it the same way. There's a moment where you begin to recognize that what kept you connected wasn't just them. It was the meaning you were giving to their actions, the way you interpreted their returns as signs of care, the way you saw their distance as something temporary rather than structural, the way you held onto the potential of what the connection could become instead of fully accepting what it consistently showed you it was. And this realization doesn't come with instant clarity or relief. It can feel heavy. It can feel uncomfortable because it asks you to face something real. That the version of the connection you were hoping for and the version that actually exists are not the same. And once you see that difference, it becomes harder to ignore, harder to rationalize, harder to keep explaining away the inconsistencies in a way that protects the connection instead of protecting yourself. And this is where your power begins to return in a very quiet but significant way. Because clarity, even when it's difficult, gives you something that confusion never could. It gives you a stable ground to stand on, a place where your decisions are no longer based on hope alone, but on understanding. And as you begin to step into that understanding, something else starts to change: the way you respond to their behavior, the way you engage with the dynamic. Because before, the inconsistency pulled you in. It made you try harder. It made you invest more, hoping to stabilize something that kept shifting. But now, instead of moving toward the inconsistency, you start to move away from it. Not in a reactive way, not in a way that's driven by anger or the need to prove something, but in a grounded way. A way that comes from recognizing that your emotional energy has value and that it deserves to be placed in something that can actually hold it. And this is often the moment where the dynamic itself begins to change, because when you stop responding in the same way, when you stop reinforcing the cycle by remaining available, no matter how inconsistent things become, the structure they were relying on starts to shift. The familiarity of knowing you'll always be there begins to fade, and that creates a different kind of response on their side. This is often when their attention seems to return with more intensity, when they sense that something is different, that you're not as accessible as you once were, that the connection is no longer something they can step in and out of without consequence. And in that moment, their behavior may shift in a way that feels surprising. They may reach out more, show more interest, offer more engagement than they have in the past. And this can be one of the most confusing stages, because it looks like the change you were hoping for all along. It feels like validation, like confirmation that what you had mattered more than you thought. But it's important to understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, because in many cases, this increase in attention is not driven by a sudden readiness for commitment. It's driven by the disruption of a pattern that once felt stable to them. The moment you stop playing the role of the consistently available connection, they feel the shift in control. And that feeling pulls them back in, not necessarily because they've resolved their underlying fears, but because the dynamic itself has changed. And if that deeper pattern hasn't been addressed, the risk is that once the sense of control is restored, the old cycle can begin again. And this is where your awareness becomes the most important factor. Because now it's not just about recognizing their behavior, it's about recognizing your response to it. The difference between reacting to the moment and responding from a place of clarity. Because the pull to go back into the familiar dynamic can be strong. The emotional connection is still there. The history is still there. The part of you that hoped for something real is still there. But alongside that, there is now a deeper understanding, an awareness of how the pattern functions, of how it feels to be inside it, of what it has slowly taken from you over time. And that awareness gives you a choice that you didn't fully have before. The choice to engage or to step back. The choice to continue investing in something that has shown you its limits, or to redirect that energy towards something that can actually meet you fully. And that choice is not always easy, because it requires you to prioritize your long-term emotional stability over the short-term comfort of familiar connection. It requires you to sit with the discomfort of letting go of something that once felt meaningful, even if it never fully became what you needed it to be. And this leads to the truth that often goes unspoken in dynamics like this, the truth that sits beneath all the confusion, all the inconsistency, all the emotional highs and lows. If someone truly values you in a way that is ready for real connection, they don't keep alternatives in the background. They don't position you as one option among many. They don't create a dynamic where your place in their life is uncertain or conditional. Real connection doesn't require you to constantly question where you stand. It doesn't require you to earn consistency through patience or understanding. It shows up clearly, it stabilizes over time, it aligns with your emotional needs instead of constantly pulling away from them. And recognizing this truth doesn't mean you dismiss what you felt. It doesn't mean the connection was meaningless. It means you're able to see it for what it actually was, not just what it had the potential to be. And that clarity, as difficult as it can be, is what allows you to move forward in a different way. A way where you are no longer trying to fit yourself into a space that was never designed to fully hold you, but instead choosing connections that meet you with the same level of presence, clarity, and intention that you've been offering all along.